Okay, hi everyone, we're back. We're going to wrap up the first section of chapter 19 for my HCC students. This is the chapter on heart anatomy and cardiac function. I'm going to switch to screen sharing. I have to click like 3 things to get there. Okay. So we left off with just talking about the location of the heart in the mediastinum within the pericardial sac. So let's talk about some of the surface and anatomy features. Things you can see on the front of the heart or the anterior surface of the heart. First of all 4 chambers, right, left ventricles, right, left atria, very thin-walled, expandable atria. There's actually an auricle on each atria to allow for expansion, just in case there's all of a sudden a rush of blood into the heart. There's an extra expandable pouch called an auricle. The ligamentum arteriosum, which should sound familiar from last chapter. It's a ligament that attaches the pulmonary trunk to the aortic arch. It's the remnant of the fetal connection between the aorta and pulmonary trunk. So there's also sulci on the surface of the heart. These are shallow grooves, and these are, when you hear the word sulcus or sulci, you should think of the grooves just like on the brain, right? Remember last semester, the sulci were the grooves on the brain. Here, they're just shallow grooves. These are marking the boundaries between chambers as well as the locations of our major arteries and vessels of the coronary circulation. So you have the coronary sulcus, which is marking the border between the atria and ventricles. This is where fat and blood vessels live or kind of hang out on the surface of the heart. There's also the anterior interventricular sulcus. This is the boundary between the right and left ventricles. And here you can see the coronary sulcus going out towards the right and the anterior interventricular sulcus. Sometimes it's called the left anterior descending or LAD sulcus going down kind of right in between the right and left ventricles there. Here you see an actual cadaver dissection of a heart, so you can actually see the vessels in place. Most of the fat has been removed so that you can identify the vessels that are within those sulci. You can really have a good view of the auricle on this image. The auricle is that expandable kind of flap on the atria. There's a right and a left one. And then again, the vessels that you can see. So we'll go through some of these vessels throughout this chapter. So the atrial connections you can see from the heart, the left atrium to the pulmonary veins, the right atrium to the coronary veins, and the vena cava, all on that posterior side of the heart. There's also the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus is a very large kind of swelling of the vessel. It collects all of the blood that has circulated to the actual myocardium, right? The blood supply to the heart. So there's 2 ways that blood goes through the heart, right? It goes through the systemic circuit and the pulmonary circuit, right? It goes through the chambers, but then the heart muscle itself needs blood so that it can pump. And that we call the coronary circulation. So this coronary sulcus is draining the blood from the coronary circulation. So all the blood that has supplied the actual myocardium and the heart muscles themselves come back into the right atrium through a little tiny hole on the posterior side called the coronary sinus. There's also a posterior interventricular sulcus. This is the boundary between the left and right ventricles on the posterior side of the heart. So here's the back side of the heart. You can see the left and right atrium. You get a good view of the superior inferior vena cava. You can see this swelling of the great cardiac vein, which is wrapping around the back side of the heart, and that swelling dumps into the right atrium. It's called the coronary sinus. You can pause the video here, go back and review these 3 questions. I'm going to keep moving. We're going to start talking about that coronary circulation. So remember, I said the 2 ways that blood flows through the heart, either through the coronary circulation, which we're about to talk about, or through the pump, right, going through the chambers and actually getting pumped out to the lungs or to the system, to the systemic circuit. So the coronary circulation is providing the nutrients to the actual heart muscle itself. During maximum exertion, the myocardial blood flow can actually go up to 9 times the resting level. So there's a huge capacity for increase in blood flow depending on demand. So there are 2 major coronary arteries. You have a right coronary artery. This follows the coronary sulcus around the heart. So this supplies the blood to the right atrium, parts of both of the ventricles, and parts of the conducting system of our heart. The coronary artery will branch into what's called the marginal arteries, which are supplying the surface of the right ventricle, as well as the posterior interventricular artery or posterior descending artery. Either one is fair game for tests, quizzes, and practicals. So just so you know, posterior interventricular or posterior descending. This is located within the posterior interventricular sulcus, and it provides that interventricular septum and parts of the ventricles with fresh blood. The coronary artery branches into the left coronary artery as well. So the coronary artery leaves the aorta, which we'll talk about in a minute, branches into right and left. The left coronary artery supplies the left ventricle, left atrium, and the interventricular septum. So there's a branch of it called the circumflex artery. This goes all the way around the coronary sulcus to meet the branches from the right coronary artery. So it wraps around the other side of the heart, kind of going towards the left. The right coronary artery branches off towards the right. The circumflex artery branches off towards the left, and they both meet at the back side of the heart. And there's also marginal artery branches coming off of the circumflex. The left coronary artery branches into the anterior interventricular or left anterior descending, LAD, artery. Sometimes in clinical settings, you'll just hear it called the LAD instead of anterior interventricular. Everyone likes to use abbreviations to save time. So that anterior interventricular sulcus is where that LAD artery is. There's actually an arterial anastomosis between the anterior and posterior interventricular arteries to help maintain continuous blood flow and blood pressure to the coronary circulation. And that's good because if an artery becomes blocked, the heart muscle is not going to die completely. Right, you'll suffer a heart attack, and some of it will be able to be repaired, but the heart doesn't die because of this anastomosis that's there kind of as a backup plan. Remember, an anastomosis is when one artery meets up with another artery. It doesn't go through a capillary network. It's just supplying one area to the other. So here you see the left coronary artery branching. You see the circumflex going around to the back, and then the anterior interventricular, or LAD, left anterior descending, and then our right coronary artery branching off into the marginal arteries and wrapping around towards the back of the heart. When we look at the back side, there you can see that circumflex artery popping around, that right coronary artery popping around, turning into that posterior interventricular artery and marginal arteries. And you can see that coronary sinus on that big blue kind of swollen vein area. So let's talk about some of those coronary veins. On the anterior surface of the heart, you have the great cardiac vein, which follows along that anterior interventricular surface. It drains the supply of the anterior interventricular artery, and it empties into that coronary sinus on the backside of the heart. And then there's anterior cardiac veins, which drain directly into the right atrium. There they are. Our great cardiac veins starting on that left side, wrapping around towards the back, and then our anterior cardiac veins, again, just dumping right back into the right atrium because it's right there, right? So let's talk about some other coronary veins. On the posterior side, you have the coronary sinus. That's that large swelling kind of dumping everything back into the right atrium. You also have the posterior cardiac vein, which is draining that whole area supplied by the circumflex artery. The small cardiac vein and the middle cardiac vein are back there as well. So, and you'll have a chance in lab to see these on a test or quiz. I would just be doing descriptions of these, or like in an essay or in a case study, I might ask you to name me the arteries that are on the back of the heart or the front of the heart, or the arteries that go here or go there. So you need to know them in context, but I would not give you a diagram on a test or quiz. The diagrams are for lab, just so you understand that. So there is something called elastic rebound that exists within our cardiac function. This is the whole idea that our heart needs to maintain continuous blood flow throughout the coronary circulation. So the contraction of the left ventricle is going to force that blood into the aorta, stretching the aorta, and then when that blood pressure relaxes, the pressure in the aorta declines, and so there's kind of like this backflow of blood down the aorta, the descending or the ascending aorta. The blood kind of relaxes back down, and flows into the coronary arteries. So I think I'm going to try to draw this out for you. It might help you a little bit. So here's the gist of it. You have your heart, right? There's your heart. It kind of looks like a liver, but it's a heart. And we'll just say, here's our aorta. Well, imagine if this is the left ventricle. That's where the blood for the systemic circuit is pumping from. Imagine this is pumping. Here's the valve for that, the aortic valve. This contracts, shoots blood right up and out of the aorta throughout the systemic circuit. Well, eventually, this stops contracting and the pressure decreases. So some of it's going to trickle back down, right? Well, guess what, right? I'm looking to see if I have a different color marker. I don't. I'll find them. I have them somewhere. I'll pull them out for a different lecture. But right about here, within our aorta, are these little holes called the aortic sinuses. Well, guess what? Those drain into the right and left coronary arteries. So these are filled with that relaxation of the blood pressure. So the left ventricle contracts, blood spurts out of the aorta, and then when that contraction's over, some of the blood, most of it here, didn't have enough oomph to get up and over the arch, kind of trickles back down and can go into the aortic sinuses and into the coronary circulation. So that's what that is explaining. Let's go back to screen share. And that's what that idea of elastic rebound is all about. It's this idea that the walls of the aorta can kind of recoil after that contraction to allow for that blood to flow back into the coronary circulation. So you can pause the video here and go back and review these 3 questions. We're going to keep chugging along through heart anatomy and talk about the internal anatomy of the heart. So our heart is made of 4 chambers, and we've already talked about these in context, so this really shouldn't be like life-changing for you, but now we're just defining them just in case you were unclear. So there are 2 atria and 2 ventricles. The atria are separated right and left sides by an interatrial septum. The ventricles, right and left, are separated by a interventricular septum. Between the atria and ventricles on either side of the heart is an atrioventricular valve, or an AV valve. These AV valves help regulate the blood flow from the atria to the ventricles. It's located, again, in between the atria and ventricles and allows for this unidirectional flow of blood. Blood will only flow from the atria to the ventricle. It does not flow from the ventricle to the atria. If it does, you have an issue. So let's talk about the right atrium. The right atrium is receiving that low oxygen blood. Your book says deoxygenated. In reality, your blood at this point has like 70% of its max capacity. So it's lower oxygen. It's not devoid of oxygen at that point. But either way, low oxygen blood returning from the systemic circuit through the superior and inferior vena cava and coronary sinus into the right atrium. The fossa ovalis is within the right atrium, doesn't do anything in a living, breathing, normal person, unless you were born with that hole in your heart not being fixed. It's fine. It doesn't do anything. It's just a remnant of that foramen ovale, which closes at birth. There's also pectinate muscles that are present within the atria. These are just ridges along the atrial wall and on the surface of the auricle to allow for contraction. The left atrium is receiving that freshly oxygenated blood from the pulmonary veins. So then we have our ventricles. Our right ventricle is receiving blood from our right atria. The AV valve is called the tricuspid valve. So here's how I remember this. It's totally weird. So you have a left AV valve, which is your bicuspid valve, and your right AV valve is your tricuspid valve. So your left is your bicuspid, your right is your tricuspid. I remember this because most of the time when you say the word right, you pronounce the T. It's the right. It's the right. It's the tricuspid valve. T and T. The word left has a T in it. Most people, including myself, I'm a poor English speaker, I guess, do not pronounce the T completely. Left, right? It's like a soft T. So the T is not really there. So remember, right tricuspid, left bicuspid. I don't know, I'm weird, that's how I remember things. Anyways, I got a little bit ahead of myself. So that tricuspid valve on the right side is preventing the backflow of blood from the right ventricle to the right atrium. With contraction, the blood is then going to go from the right ventricle out of the pulmonary valve, which is sometimes called the pulmonary semilunar valve, and that goes into the pulmonary trunk, into the pulmonary circulation, and then back into the left atrium. So that right AV valve has 3 flaps. That's why it's called the tricuspid valve. The cusps of that valve, it's kind of like these little, and obviously I only have 2 hands, so I can't really show it to you, but it's kind of like these little flaps that open and close. Imagine 3 of them there, right? Those flaps are attached to cords. The cords are called chordae tendineae. The chordae tendineae are attached, they're like little fibers that are attached to papillary muscles. The papillary muscles are like pulleys that open and close the flap. So imagine a little string here, literally pulling that flap open. That's what the papillary muscles do. They open and close the flaps. There's also a moderator band. The moderator band tenses those papillary muscles just before the contraction so that there's not this kind of slamming effect with those AV valves. It helps to moderate the shutting of them. Our left ventricle has a much thicker myocardial wall than the right ventricle because it produces more pressure. It has a stronger contraction. This makes sense. Our right ventricle is only pumping blood to the lungs, which are right next door, right? And the lungs are very delicate tissue. So the pressure, if the pressure is too high, the blood would burst through those alveolar capillaries and your lungs would disintegrate. Oops. So the pressure from the right side of the heart is relatively low compared to the pressure from the left side of the heart. The pressure from the left side of the heart is elevated, much higher, because you have to get up out of that ascending aortic arch and then all the way to, to your toes, to your brain, right? All over the body. So the pressure is much higher. The left ventricle is receiving the blood from the left atrium. The AV valve there is called the bicuspid valve. It's also sometimes called the mitral valve. You need to know both. Use the terms interchangeably. There are a pair of cusps instead of 3 of them. That's why it's called the bicuspid, to prevent the backflow of blood into the atrium while the ventricle is contracting. So with contraction, the blood from the left ventricle is going to go out of the aortic valve or the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. The trabeculae carneae is the muscular ridges within the ventricles. So remember in our spongy bone, right? We have our compact bone, which was made of osteons, these little tree trunk-like structures all jammed together. But then you had the trabeculae, that was the spongy bone, right? It kind of looked like stalactites and stalagmites. It was where the yellow and red bone marrow were. Well, this trabeculae carneae kind of looks like that, except it's muscle. So it's very easy to see what it is. It has that same kind of spider webby like structure, but it is heart muscle. And it's just a muscular ridge on the inside of our ventricles helping to assist getting oomph into that contraction. So here's a cross-section of the heart. You can see all of this in action and what it does. Let's start with the right atrium and all of the pathways in. So in the back, you have that coronary sulcus, or coronary sinus rather, the coronary sinus dumping blood from the coronary circulation back into the right atrium. Superior and inferior vena cava, dumping blood from the systemic circuit back into the right atrium. From the right atrium, the blood flows through that tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. In the right ventricle here, you can see our right AV valve, or our tricuspid valve. You can see the chordae tendineae, the papillary muscles, the moderator band, and the trabeculae carneae. After the right ventricle contracts, it's going to push blood up through the pulmonary semilunar valve, out of the pulmonary trunk, to the pulmonary arteries, and to the pulmonary capillaries, pulmonary veins, which will return that freshly oxygenated blood back to the left atrium. From the left atrium, this blood will pass through the bicuspid or mitral valve, which has 2 flaps, the chordae tendineae holding it together, attached to papillary muscles amongst the amongst the trabeculae carinae, of that muscular ridge inside of our left ventricle. And when that left ventricle contracts, notice how thick that myocardial layer is on the left side compared to the right side. That blood is going to shoot up and out. You can't really see the aortic semilunar valve in this image, but it's going to go up through that ascending aorta, past the aortic arch, out either one of those vessels from the aortic arch, and down the descending aorta to wherever it needs to go in the systemic circuit. That's the flow of blood through the heart. If you're an auditory learner, re-listen to what I just said over and over and over again until you can repeat it. If you're a visual learner, see if you can draw it out. One of the things I suggest doing to learn these things is to take, where my note cards go? Take a bunch of note cards, right? Write each of the steps on a note card and then shuffle it up and see if you can put it in order yourself. Or if you're a really kinesthetic learner, you like to move and do things, put them on Post-its. Take your Post-its, stick them on the wall, stick them on your table, and see if you can move them around like that. Or just point and touch the image, right? This image, the image from that last page, just came from page 694 of your textbook. Look at that image. There's great descriptions of everything right there, better than what I just said to you. Take your finger, and as you're passing your finger across those images, say the words. Say them out loud. So you're hearing it, you're touching it, you're moving. Or redraw it. Redraw it yourself and see if you can recreate that diagram and caption it yourself. There's lots of ways for you to learn this. Lots of students get hung up on it. One of the key things to realize is that while I'm saying blood starts in the right atrium and then leaves in the left ventricle, really, blood is at all parts of this journey at any given time. There's no point in this process when your left atrium is empty, when your right ventricle is empty. It's all full all the time. It's a circuit. So as one group of blood is moving on, another one's coming right in, right? It's kind of like a ride at Disney World. It's always cycling new things through, right? New blood is always coming through. So you have to kind of keep that image in your head and realize that it's not just, okay, well, the blood was just there. How's it there again, right? Because it's new blood that's just constantly being cycled through. Let me go back to screen share here. Okay, so let's keep talking about these structures, and let's compare for a minute the right and left ventricle. So the right ventricle has a relatively thin myocardial wall because it's only pushing that blood to the pulmonary circuit. As I mentioned, when it contracts, it's squeezing and pushing blood out to the pulmonary trunk. Minimal effort, doesn't have to have very high pressure. Our left ventricle has a very thick wall, very round cross-section, has to develop 4 to 6 times as much pressure as that right ventricle. When it contracts, the diameter is going to decrease and the distance between the base and the apex. So not only does it get narrower, but it's getting shorter as well. So it's really pushing that blood up and out. And that motion is going to reduce the volume of the right ventricle also to help push that blood into the pulmonary circuit. So here you can see the cross sections. The cross section of the left ventricle is more round because it's going to decompress in diameter and shrink in kind of depth, push that blood up and out. And then just by default, that right ventricle is going to get smaller because that left ventricle is pumping. So the right ventricle does a little bit of work, but really it's the left ventricle that does the majority of the work for our heart. So there you can see the 3 review questions. You can pause the video here, go back and review this section. We're going to move on to 19.7 and talk about our heart valves. So our valves do different things during contraction and relaxation cycles. Our heart is not, at any given time, our heart is not completely contracted or completely relaxed. It's always kind of in this in-between state. Part of it's contracted and part of it is relaxed. And we'll look at this whole cardiac cycle in the next section. But for right now, we're just trying to understand what these parts are so that we can put them together and understand them later on in this chapter. So the AV valves, or atrioventricular valves, when they're open, this is when the blood pressure from contracting is going to push the cusps apart. The chordae tendineae are loose, there's no resistance, right? They're open. The semilunar valves are generally closed, right? Little pressure from ventricles, the blood pressure keeps them shut, no big deal. They're going to open once the pressure in the ventricles gets high enough to push that blood up and out. And We'll talk about that physiology later. But by default, the AV valves are open. By default, the semilunar valves are closed. So let's get the image here of where these valves are in the heart. The AV valves are kind of off to the sides, right? You have a left side and a right side, or right side and a left side, depending on am I a mirror image for you or not. So you have these two AV valves in the middle, right? Well, your semilunar valves are almost like stacked on top of each other in the very center, and they're each pointing, you know, a different direction. Your aortic semilunar valves pointing one way, and your pulmonary semilunar valves pointing the other way. So you have these valves here and these valves here. And then surrounding this whole structure is all your myocardium. Your wrists, or your fists in this example, are made of connective tissue. This makes sense because if we're talking about a conducting pathway, if we're talking about sending electrochemical signals for these cells to contract, you don't want that to influence your valves, right? So the connective tissue is like insulated from all of the electrical contracting stuff that's going on. So it's not influenced at all by any of the electrical contracting stuff that the cardiocytes are doing. These are made of these, you know what I'm saying, the AV valves and the semilunar valves. These are made of the connective tissue. So you have connective tissue surrounded by all of this cardiac tissue. So let's take a look at how these things are kind of put together and working together. So during relaxation, our AV valves are closed. As our ventricles are contracting and our atria are relaxing, our AV valves are shut. So blood pressure from the contracting ventricles is basically going to push the cusps of those valves together and get them to shut. Kind of like a door slamming when the wind blows by. The papillary muscles are going to prevent them from opening back up. They're pretty much sealed shut. The semilunar valves are going to open because of the increased pressure within the ventricles. It's going to basically force them to open up and allow the blood to kind of spurt out, if you will, into the vessels. So this is during ventricular contraction. Take a look. We have our AV valves closed, our semilunar valves open. Here's the sagittal section, or a frontal section rather, where you have your AV valve shut, our semilunar valve open. We go back to the previous slide here. This is during ventricular relaxation. Our AV valves are open, our semilunar valves are shut. During ventricular contraction, our semilunar valves are open, our AV valves are shut. All right. I have a demonstration for this, but I need a juice box for it. I know it's weird and random, but trust me, you're going to understand it when I do it. And I just need to go to the store and get a juice box. But I'm going to make a video and I'll do the demonstration for you. So let's talk about heart, a little bit more about this cardiac skeleton. So remember I said that our valves are surrounded by connective tissue. Well, this connective tissue basically makes up what we call a cardiac skeleton. It's a fibrous connective tissue frame that's made of all of this connective tissue surrounding the valves, and it's basically insulating those structures from that electrical component of the heart. It electrically isolates the atria from the ventricles and helps to control all of the activity that goes on. So this is just looking at the cardiac skeleton in general. It's just all that connective tissue that's supporting the valves, holding them together. So our semilunar valves are half moon shaped. They're kind of more of cup shape instead of cusp. They're more like cups like this. And so they're going to prevent the backflow into the air. So they're more shaped kind of like a bowl, and then they open and close as needed. With the ventricular contraction, they're going to open, and then with ventricular relaxation, they're going to close. They don't require any muscular braces, such as the chordae tendineae, like the AV valves do. They all kind of support each other. The aortic sinuses, as I mentioned, I drew those out on my little whiteboard on the last lecture. Those are little tiny slits on the side of the aortic valve, and that's where the right and left coronary arteries originate. And here you can see open and closed versions of these valves. There are several valve problems that could arise. Just trying to forget which page we're on in our book. We're still on page like 697 if you're following along in the book. Valve problems could be like valvular heart disease, VHD. This could be when the valve function is actually deteriorating to the point where the heart can't maintain adequate blood flow. So this could be a congenital condition, or it could be caused by carditis, swelling of the heart. Severe cases, you can actually replace the heart valve with a prosthetic. There are actually bioprosthetic valves that come from pigs and cows or even cadavers. Very cool stuff. This is an artificial heart valve. They're actually able to make, I want to say it's Gore-Tex that they do them out of too. They can make heart valves out of Gore-Tex, which is like a multi-weather type material. And it's just something that your body doesn't easily reject, and that your cells will actually surround when it's in your body. So when it's first put in your body, obviously it's a foreign tissue, but eventually your cells will migrate and surround it, and eventually it becomes you. So the cells, when they do cell sampling of, these artificial heart valves 10 years down the road, they're finding out that the cells that are on that artificial heart valve are now your cells. They're not, wherever they came from. It's really cool stuff. I'm going to stop this. You know what? No, we'll do the clinical model. So you can pause the video here, do these 3 questions. We have one little clinical thing we're going to talk about before the end of this lecture. And this is all about arteriosclerosis. Arterio, meaning artery, sclerosis is the hardening of. So this is the thickening or toughening of artery walls. Typically, it's linked to complications of about half of all U.S. deaths. Crazy, half of U.S. deaths. It's not motorcycle accidents or automobile accidents or overdoses. It is the hardening of your arteries, which for the most part is an environmental thing. It's something you can control. So arteriosclerosis of the coronary vessels is responsible for coronary artery disease or heart disease. Arteriosclerosis of the brain arteries can lead to strokes. So there's also atherosclerosis. Arteriosclerosis is the hardening of the arteries. Atherosclerosis is the fatty deposits within them. This can cause damage to the endothelial lining of those vessels. It's the most common form of arteriosclerosis. It's usually associated with elevated cholesterol levels, when the fatty masses will basically form plaques inside of the vessels, restricting blood flow. Sorry, I thought I had a spider on me. I was about to freak out. It restricts blood flow to that area and can be very dangerous, especially if those plaques can kind of dislodge and go and block blood flow to a smaller area of the body. There are several risk factors involved in atherosclerosis. More common in elderly, just an accumulation of life events. Gender is much more common in men. High cholesterol levels, high blood pressure, and cigarette smoking, all linked to atherosclerosis. Again, one of the number 1 causes of death in the United States. In fact, coronary artery disease, heart disease, is the number 1 killer in the United States, and the majority of it is linked back to these conditions. This is just cross-section showing what they look like. You can see those fatty deposits, how narrow the arteries can get, blocking that blood flow. There are some treatment options, though. Replacing the damaged segment, compressing the plaque with an angioplasty, very common, very effective. Advantage is very low mortality rate. It's very quick surgery, very high success rate, and it's outpatient. So you're in and out in the same day. So it's very convenient. Here is the picture of the balloon and the artery, basically literally going in. They typically will go in through the femoral artery, which is very large, superficial, easy to get to, and they'll just go on up to wherever they need to go and inflate and then pull the tube out. Easy peasy. Or so they say. Yeah, I couldn't do it. So with coronary artery disease, this is the partial or complete blockage of coronary circulation. So the atherosclerosis and arteriosclerosis can be anywhere in the body. Specifically on the heart, we call it coronary artery disease. So the process, or this condition rather, produces reduced blood flow to a particular area of the heart, which is called coronary ischemia. Typically what they'll do is they'll put a dye into the heart, and they'll follow the coronary blood flow, and then they can see that part of the blood flow is blocked, right? This is usually caused by atherosclerosis. It could also arise from a thrombus or a blood clot that was floating around in the body. Not as common. The plaques can actually be visible. And treatment could be a wire mesh or a stent, which can help hold the vessels open. This is what I was talking about with those angiographies or different types of imaging that can be used to trace the blood flow, where the blood is going. You can put a stent in to hold the vessel open. Or they'll do a bypass surgery, which obviously that's not on the slide, but a bypass surgery is literally where they take, I'll go up to another slide here, where they'll take a part of a vessel, usually from your lower leg or your upper leg, and use it to kind of bridge the gap between different non-functioning vessels so that blood can get to that area. Like if you look at the heart on this right side of your page here, you'll see obviously there is a huge lack of blood flow to the left side of the heart. Typically that left anterior descending or anterior interventricular artery is the one that's blocked. And so they'll have to get artificial arteries and kind of shunt the blood from this kind of more superior region of the artery down to the lower part. Otherwise, those heart cells are going to die and you're not going to be able to have a good contraction. The rest of your body is going to be affected by that. So that concludes section 19.8. We're going to stop this lecture here, and this actually concludes everything for the week. We'll pick up next week with the second section of this chapter, which is all about the cardiac cycle. We're going to put all these pieces together the next time we lecture. So, bye. Have a good one.